11 o'clock, good evening, and welcome to our J News. After inheriting the throne at just 25, Queen Elizabeth II gave a lifetime of service to the job, providing a bedrock of stability for the monarchy as the world shifted around her. Through 1,200 years of war, death, and empire building, succession in the British monarchy has rarely been a straight line. The crown has zigged and zagged through 37 generations, landing on the heads of an anointed few. Some inherited it upon their father's final breath. Others conquered armies and murdered rivals to grab it for themselves. But for one little girl, that intricate crown of gold, ermine, and 440 precious gems found its way to her through a royal scandal. Weighing 2.3 kilograms, St. Edward's crown was placed upon Queen Elizabeth II's head for a mere moment during an ancient ceremony that transformed her from Lilibet Windsor into the sovereign. The most scared of Britain's treasures was then carefully packed away for her eventual successor. But every monarch bears the weight of that brief moment for the rest of their reign. Upon Elizabeth's shoulders, she carried her kingdom's hopes, her people's love, their imagination, and their expectations. Sometimes she even bore their disappointment in her. But throughout her 7-decade reign, Elizabeth upheld the vow she once made as a young princess. My whole life, whether it be long or short, shall be devoted to your service. Her life was far longer than she perhaps expected, but her devotion never wavered. Elizabeth Alexandra Mary Windsor was born on the 21st of April 1926 during the reign of her grandfather, King George V, the man she called Grandpapa England. She was third in line to the throne behind her uncle David and her own father, Albert, the Duke of York. The Princess of York was then just a decorative object in the House of Windsor, one that would gather dust and obsolescence when her uncle and father produced prize male hairs. Even as a minor royal, there was something about little Elizabeth. It was as if only the toddler herself knew what fate had conspired for her. She has an air of authority and reflectiveness astonishing in an infant, Winston Churchill said of the 2-year-old Elizabeth, describing her as a character. Decades later, when he was 77 and she was 25, Churchill was the first of 13 prime ministers to serve under Elizabeth. Forbidden love would change her destiny. When King George V died in 1936, the charming David took the throne as King Edward VIII, only to renounce it within a year to marry his lover, American divorcee Wallis Simpson. His decision to choose love over the crown plunged the monarchy into crisis. He abdicated, and Albert was proclaimed King George VI. 10-year-old Elizabeth, dubbed Lilibet by her family, was suddenly heir presumptive to the throne. It was up to the quiet Albert and his dutiful daughter to save the crown. 15 years later, Lilibet would become Her Majesty, but not before she fell in love, survived a war, and endured a great loss. Elizabeth once described her ascension as very sudden, but she had been training for the role most of her life. Under the watch of private tutors, the princess studied everything from geopolitics and constitutional history to religion, law, and languages. She read official papers with her father and met informally with heads of state. Raised in a loving and private family called We Four by their father, Elizabeth and her younger sister Margaret also found time for play. Lilibet is my pride, Margaret is my joy, King George would often say of her solemn hair and rebellious spare. They rode horses and kept pets, including the first of more than 30 corgis Elizabeth would own in a lifetime. Elizabeth was 13 in 1939 when World War II broke out and the shadow of Nazism fell over Europe. Her mother, the former Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, was determined to keep the family in Buckingham Palace as German bombs rained down in London, declaring, "The children won't go without me. I won't leave without the king, and the king will never leave." As the war intensified, however, the sisters were evacuated to Windsor Castle. The following year, at 14, Elizabeth made her first radio broadcast. We know from experience what it means to be away from those we love most of all, the princess said, in a message of hope for the children of Britain who had been evacuated and separate from their families. In 1945, after months of pleading with her father, 18-year-old Elizabeth joined the war effort. She trained as a driver and mechanic in a women's auxiliary territorial service, though the war ended before she could make practical use of her skills. One of her major joys was to get dirt onto her nails and grease stains in her hands and display these signs as labor to her friends, Collier's magazine wrote a few years later. In 1947, 21-year-old Elizabeth married the man she had been smitten with for years, Greek-born British naval officer Philip Mountbatten, a discount cousin. They had first met at a wedding in 1934 when Elizabeth was just 8. But it wasn't until 1939, when she was 13 and he 18, that the first flames of romance were kindled. The quiet, reserved princess and the boisterous Philip enjoyed a game of croquet together, after which, as Elizabeth's cousin Margaret Rhodes once recalled, she never looked at anyone else. Philip, who said he had fallen in love completely and unreservedly, wooed the future queen through love letters. The pair were engaged in 1946, though it was kept secret until Elizabeth came of age in 1947. They were married in Westminster Abbey in November that year. Elizabeth was so popular with Britons that many donated her ration cards to help pay for the ivory sent to make her wedding dress. The wedding cake, which stood 2.7 meters high and weighed just more than 222 kilograms, was made with dried fruit donated by the Australian Girl Guides. Prince Philip cut the towering masterpiece with his sword, and one layer was sent back to Australia as a thank you. The pair were married for more than 73 years, and the Queen often spoke of Philip as her strength and stay. I owe him a debt greater than he would ever claim, or we shall ever know, she said in her golden wedding anniversary speech in 1997. Their strong bond would be tested, but also helped them through dark times from the Annus Horribilis of 1992 to the death of Princess Diana 5 years later. The year after the wedding, their first son Charles was born. Daughter Anne came 2 years later in 1950. As newlyweds, Elizabeth and her husband spent time living in Malta, where Philip served in the Royal Navy. She immersed herself in shopping, sightseeing, picnicking, and dancing the samba. But Elizabeth's time as a naval wife, perhaps the closest she would ever come to an ordinary life, was cut short in 1952. Elizabeth was more than 7,000 kilometers from her home when she, as the story goes, went up a tree a princess and came down a queen. She and Prince Philip were in Kenya at the Treetops Hotel, beginning a 5-month tour of Africa and Australia. She spent the day capturing cinefilms of elephants before returning her cabin high in the trees. That night, King George VI, whose health had been failing, died in his sleep of lung cancer. The news took some hours to reach her remote location, and it was Philip who eventually told her she was now queen. She is said to have reacted stoically and with grace, putting aside her sadness to write letters apologizing for cancelling the rest of her tour. Days later in London, she spoke to the thousands of people who turned out of her proclamation. My heart is too full for me to say more to you today other than I shall always work, as my father did throughout his reign, to advance the happiness and prosperity of my peoples, spread as they are all the world over, she said. And work she did. She came to the throne as a 25-year-old mother of 2 and gave a lifetime of service to the job. We'll see you in part 2.